Hi, class. Today we are going to look at lipids, specifically talking about digestion, absorption, and how they are transported around your body for cells to use. So, before we start, see if you can think of the three types of lipids that we discussed and maybe you read about on your own. So, first off, we have phospholipids, which make up our cell membranes. We also have sterols, which have that ring shaped structure that do things like make hormones. And then we also have triglycerides, which we're going to focus on today because today we are talking about dietary fat and how it's taken into the body. And the vast majority of the fat that we get in our diet is going to be in the form of triglycerides. So let's start with that. The structure of triglycerides are kind of straightforward. It contains this big molecule called glycerol and 3 fatty acid tails. It's a pretty large molecule, so we're going to need to break it down before we can take it into our cells. And when we break it down, which we'll talk about in a sec, we pop these fatty acid tails off. So, just a couple reminders over here on the right. What's the difference between lipase and bile? Because they both play a role in the digestion of fats. Well, lipase ends in ASE, so we know it's an enzyme. And we talked about hydrolysis before, breaking down a larger molecule into smaller parts. And we'll see this in fat digestion. Lipases hydrolyze these bonds that hold these fatty acids together to this glycerol. So lipases pop these fatty acid tails off this glycerol. So it's a kind of hydrolysis. Bile, on the other hand, is not an enzyme, so it doesn't chemically break apart the triglyceride molecule, but it's important for a different reason. So, in general, you'll see either bile or maybe bile salts because it's not one molecule, it's kind of a category of molecules. But fat, so think about maybe if you go to the grocery store and there's a bottle of salad dressing that has oil in it. If you look at it and it's been on the shelf for a while, the oil layer will be on top and the watery layer will be on the bottom because fats are less dense, they float. Water's more dense, it sinks. And also fats like oils, which are triglycerides, are hydrophobic. They don't want to interact with water, so they're going to stay separate in sort of like one big fat glob, right? So that's fine. But when we go to digest them, our digestive system, just like most of our body, has a lot of water. So any fat that we eat from our diet is going to form like one big glob in our digestive system. And that's going to make it hard to digest because lipases can only chemically break down the triglycerides that are on the surface of that large fat glob, and they can't get to all the fat in the middle. So bile is going to help with this. It serves as an emulsifier. It emulsifies fats. So picture that giant fat glob, right? Bile is going to interfere with those like hydrophobic interactions and turn that giant fat glob into a bunch of little ones. So I tried to draw this over here. You have all these little fat globs that are surrounded by bile. So bile sort of separates those big fat globs into these little fat globs. And that's going to make it a lot easier for lipase to come and break down fat because there's a lot more surface area that lipase can come chemically pull those fatty acids off that glycerol molecule. So that's called emulsification. These tiny little globs, by the way, they're called micelles, are suspended in that watery environment. So that's emulsification. They make these little globs that can be suspended within that water. All right. On the left, let's look at organs that secrete lipases and bile. So first off, we have the mouth, right? Lingual lipase in the mouth starts fat digestion, not a whole lot, but you get a little bit in the mouth. We'll kind of go out of order here, I guess. So bile is made in your liver and stored in your gallbladder, right? Secreted into the small intestine. Your stomach also has a lipase, gastric lipase, right? So we get maybe about 10% of fat digestion that happens in the stomach. Your pancreas, you might remember, also makes a lipase, right? It's secreted into the small intestine where it does its job. And your small intestine also makes its own lipase, right? As part of those like brush border enzymes, you have intestinal lipase. So the bulk of fat digestion happens in your small intestine, right? A little bit in the mouth, a little bit in the stomach. Most of it happens in the small intestine, and we get all of absorption happening there as well. All right, let's think about absorption for a moment, because when you think about absorption of things like carbs and protein, right, they're broken into small molecules like monosaccharides and amino acids. Those things are taken into your intestinal cells and go directly into the bloodstream, and they enter the capillaries in your intestines and they go into the blood and travel to the liver. Fats, however, are going to take a little bit of a different route because they are so much bigger. So most fats are going to be too big to be directly absorbed into your bloodstream. So they have to take a route through the lymphatic system first. So surrounding your intestines, you have lymphatic capillaries called lacteals. I would star this word, make sure you know this word. So lacteals are lymphatic capillaries. They don't form a loop the way that your like circulatory system does. They're kind of like one-way capillaries. They're blind. They start in your small intestine and then continue on through the rest of your lymphatic system. And that lymph, that if you pulled lymph out of your lymphatic system in your abdomen, it would look very cloudy because it contains a lot of fats from your food. So these lacteals, they're lymphatic capillaries. They absorb these fatty acids and glycerol molecules that are kind of left over because they're too big to enter the blood. So for a moment here, guys, I'm going to step back. We ate triglycerides, we broke it down, and now we absorbed it. Now that it's in your lymphatic system, it's kind of weird. It gets turned back into triglycerides. So all those parts get put back together as triglycerides, and they need to travel through your lymphatic system before they can enter the blood. But those triglycerides, right, they're really hydrophobic. They do not like the watery environment of your lymphatic system. So they're going to glob together and not be easy to transport. Luckily, your body has a way to kind of help that problem. And we'll talk about a few different kinds on the back, but chylomicrons are going to be a way that your body helps transport those hydrophobic fats around your body because they don't want to be in the blood. They don't want to interact with the water. They're going to be hard to transport. So your chylomicrons transport those fats from your diet in the form of triglycerides, and they travel through your lymphatic system where they get dumped into circulation in your blood, right? So those lymphatic, the lymphatic system, those chylomicrons get dumped into the circulatory system. They enter your blood. So as those chylomicrons travel through your body, all the cells from the tissues that are around, wherever they end up, start pulling triglycerides out, which is kind of cool. So those triglycerides are broken down again, so they can enter the cells where they're put back together as triglycerides. So your cells are going to be pulling out triglycerides from these chylomicrons. So some cells, like adipose cells, are going to be a big one that pull a lot of material out of your chylomicrons. So they take those triglycerides and put them into storage. Some tissues, like muscles, for instance, are a really big one that take up a lot of triglycerides because they can use fatty acids directly as energy, which makes them kind of unique and kind of cool. So cells are pulling out triglycerides as those chylomicrons circle around your body. After about a half a day or so, those chylomicrons are shrunken down because so much triglycerides are taken out. And when they get kind of like almost like a shell, like a leftover material that hasn't been used, your liver is going to take up those chylomicrons and they're going to process them. So your liver processes fats. It takes things that are left over from your chylomicrons, your dietary fats, and your liver also makes its own fats as well. And so it's going to process those. It might package them up again and send them back out. And that's what we'll look at on the back. Right? So triglycerides are broken down. They are absorbed into your lymphatic system. They travel through these chylomicrons around the body and end up at your liver to be processed. So backside. I love this image. There's a couple things that I want to point out before we talk about it. But just so you know, this comes straight from page 153 in your book. So I think page like 150 to 153 talks about this stuff. But I like this one, so I pulled it straight out of your book. If you look at the bottom, these are 4 different kinds of lipoproteins. You can say lipoproteins. So lipoproteins, what are they? They're the fat transporters, right? Fat does not like to travel around your body. It doesn't like to interact with the water, so it needs a little bit of help. So lipoproteins are transport molecules for carrying fats around our blood, right? Chylomicrons start in the lymphatic system, but they also end up in the blood as well. All right, if we look at this graph, you can see on the left is percent of these 4 different components, so triglycerides, phospholipids, cholesterol, and protein. And then on the x-axis, we have our 4 different lipoproteins. What you can't tell from this graph is that these are in the order from biggest to smallest. So if we look at our lipoproteins, chylomicrons are the biggest, and they get smaller and smaller. HDL is going to be the smallest. And we'll talk about what all these are next. So make sure you know, I might give you a clue, like on the test, for instance, like which lipoprotein is the biggest, right? And some other stuff about it. So knowing the size might help you answer questions. Chylomicrons are unique because they are the only one of the 4 that contain fats that are directly derived from your diet. And it also makes sense, knowing this, that they're made mostly of triglycerides, because when you eat fat, right, it's mostly in the form of triglycerides. So this orange section, right, 85% of chylomicrons are made of triglycerides. We'll kind of compare that to these other 3, which are a little bit different because they all in some form originate from your liver. And so we'll talk about that next. But chylomicrons are the only ones that contain diet-derived fats. Right? And also know that they are mostly triglycerides. I'm not going to have you memorize this number because they shrink as they travel, right? So they won't stay at 85%. They'll shrink as they travel around your body for like 12 to 14 hours. All right, VLDLs. This is the first of the ones that your body makes. Your liver, processes these and puts them together. And they don't have a very original name. They're called very low density lipoproteins. Right? Low density means if you put all these materials, in a test tube, and you separate it out based on density, these would float on the top. Very low density lipoproteins would be like the top layer because they have much more fat compared to protein. Protein's going to be heavier and fat's going to be less dense. So very low density lipoproteins. And if you look at our percentages, these are going to be about half triglycerides. So these are going to go out from the liver to the bloodstream. They're going to travel around your body, and cells are going to pull materials from them as they need. Right? They're going to pull triglycerides out. They're going to pull phospholipids out. They might pull cholesterol out for different things. And eventually, those VLDLs are going to get much smaller, right? So they shrink down and they contain a lot less triglycerides. So that we're going to call them LDLs. So VLDLs turn into LDLs. And LDL stands for low density lipoprotein, right? They're still pretty low density, but they contain less fat, so they don't float up as high as your VLDLs. You don't need to know that. That's just where they get their name. So LDL, low density lipoproteins, and if we look at the colors here, right, they're about half cholesterol. And your body needs cholesterol for stuff, but if you have a lot of LDLs floating around, it sometimes can be a reflection of maybe your body making too much cholesterol. So we'll talk in a minute here that LDL levels, you generally want these to be low because it means you don't have a lot of extra cholesterol floating around your body. So these are about half cholesterol. Everybody has these, but you generally want these numbers to be pretty low. So VLDLs, right, eventually turn into LDLs. And then eventually those will go back to the liver to be like repackaged and reprocessed. Your liver also makes this last one called HDLs, or high density lipoproteins. Right? So they are the most dense because they contain the most relative amount of protein to their size. So these are about half protein, right? Not a lot of fats in them. Your liver sends these out. They're kind of like the cleanup crew. So they'll send them out to your body to collect things like cholesterol and other fats from cells, like adipose cells, and bring them back to the liver. So these are like a good thing. If you have high levels of HDL, it means even though they also contain cholesterol, it's generally cholesterol that's returning to the liver and being like kind of cleaned up from your body. So if you ever have a lipid, blood analysis, and sometimes you'll see this listed as like LDL as bad cholesterol and HDL as good cholesterol. It's because high levels of LDL are associated with things like atherosclerosis and like heart disease. So you want low levels of LDLs because it's sometimes called the bad cholesterol. It means your body is making too much and there's nowhere for it really to go. HDLs are oftentimes called good cholesterol, right? Even though they contain cholesterol, you want high levels of these because it means your body is like bringing cholesterol like back to the liver. It's kind of being like cleaned up. So you want high levels of HDL. High levels of HDL are associated with low risk of heart disease. So make sure you know biggest to smallest. Make sure you know this is fat derived, where all three of these originate from your body. And make sure you know that this one's mostly triglycerides. This one's about half triglycerides, about half cholesterol, and about half protein. And then we'll also look some more at bad cholesterol and good cholesterol and how fats can have different kinds of fats in the diet can have effects on health. So thank you very much.